Hello, my name's James Waller and I am the head teacher of Sunningdale School.
Hi, my name's Frances Mihailovic and I'm a class teacher and the Informal Pathway Lead.
Sunningdale School is a school for children with severe, profound and multiple learning difficulties, a number of which also have autism. The school's curriculum is underpinned by a pathway approach. We have the early years foundation stage, and then a pre-formal pathway, an informal pathway, semi-formal pathway and a formal pathway. So Frances, you're the pathway lead in our informal pathway, the pathway we call the semi-formal explore pathway. Now, the characteristics of the learners in that pathway are that they are children with very complex communication and interaction needs. They're children that don't engage particularly well. They don't have very good exploration or good persistence skills, and that's something we want to develop in this pathway. Do you want to talk a little bit about your general classroom setup and how you decide what you're going to set up in a classroom and how you decide you're going to set up activities, resources and environments for the pupils in your class?
So as a result of the pupils not having the best kind of exploration skills and a lot of the time being quite reliant on adults to initiate things, we want to ensure that we've got everything out possible to encourage independent exploration and initiation, and to do that the pupils need to be motivated before we can expect them to be engaged. So every pupil, not just in the informal pathway but in the whole school, have engagement profiles, which has kind of things that the pupils find motivating, kind of what activities, what environments, but then also how their different areas of engagement look.
Okay, so we're going to look at a clip of your class now and we'll have a conversation about what's happening.
So I mentioned that some of the pupils have can be quite dysregulated, and Leo, the boy who's working with the physio ball, had come in having not slept very much, quite upset, and he is very reliant on an adult to help him regulate. But the fact that actually he's letting the adult be in his space and co-regulate with him is massive progress for him. And Leon, the boy who's mark making on the table, earlier in the year was very reliant on an adult model, and he'd copy exactly what an adult did. And he didn't really initiate much exploration, but the fact that he's working not with an adult, independently, accessing something and getting such joy out of it and smiling when he's doing it, because we knew that he finds mark making really motivating, and we want to encourage him to be as independent as possible because it is a skill he found quite challenging. And then Daniel, who's working on this table, is doing some breakfast club work. So Daniel has some subject specific skills, but he really struggles to cross-contextualise things. So he could count out a certain amount, but only in set contexts, whereas he's starting to do it in much kind of more activities, and he's counting out coins to exchange for bagels for his breakfast club, and just developing his early preparing for adulthood skills, where he's using his subject specific skills, but really functionally.
Yeah, and you've talked there about Daniel having some subject specific skills, and I think what's probably important to point out to people is the way that these classes are put together and the way this pathway is put together is not actually anything to do with the developmental level of the child. It's about having an appropriate approach for that child's needs, their ability to initiate, cross-contextualise, engage, tolerate uncertainty, and all of those kind of life skills that lead, like you say, towards preparation for adulthood, rather than actually catering in a streamed way to their developmental levels necessarily. Do you want to talk a bit about, I suppose while we're on that, do you want to talk a little bit about the developmental levels of the pupils in the clip?
Yes, so they are quite varied. So one of the pupils who's in the clip at the moment and outside, in terms of kind of his developmental assessment, he's still working at a similar level to some of our pre-formal pupils, but he needs lots and lots of sensory integration. He needs to learn to initiate more independently. So although he's kind of developmentally working at a slightly lower level than some of the other pupils, the approach really works for him because the things that he needs are around his communication, his interaction, etc. Right through to some of the pupils do have some subject-specific skills and do have a few early play skills, but they still need to learn to be more autonomous, to learn how to problem solve, and the things that the pathway can really, really promote for them.
Okay, so we've talked around this a little bit, and it is obviously the informal approach that we use is a very low demand approach, and the pupils are being given a lot of independence. How and where do you make the decisions around at which point you're going to engage with the pupils? So they're given time at activities, they start to explore, hopefully independently. That's something we're trying to develop in this pathway. But at what point do you, now I'm sure it's individual for every single child, but at what point do you kind of make those decisions around when an adult will engage or start to scaffold the learning with the child?
Yes, I think a lot of it, like you said, is knowing the individual child, but also offering things, making things as motivating as we can, so the pupils actually motivated to join in, or offering things as a choice. So there I've just asked Leon, I noticed he wasn't engaged in anything, and offered him an option of something, but he said no, and then it's respecting the pupil's choice. So that, okay, and then developing that relationship where pupils feel heard and they feel like they're in control, and as a result, they trust the adults in that room and they are more likely to kind of be receptive to those adults and build relationships with them and hopefully want to work alongside them and want to follow adult demands.
One of the things that we use as a school are the personalised learning plans that are made up out of kind of scruffy targets but can be quite specific, and they are matched very closely to the pupils' developmental levels and their next steps of learning. Do you want to talk a little bit about how they're used once somebody does engage with the child?
So I mentioned before that kind of pupils also have engagement profiles, and when we're thinking around what we're going to set up in the classroom, we don't only think around what you're going to find engaging, but you're at school, we want to encourage you to make developmental progress as well. So we've got very small class sizes, and as a result the staff in the class know each pupil really, really well. And as a result, they know the sort of targets pupils are working towards. So for example, Jake, who's working in the water tray, used to just play with water but wouldn't use tools when he was exploring. Whereas actually now that staff know he's got targets around using tools, it's something that they'll work on with him. So there's always things out that encourage pupils to work towards those targets, and we make everything as motivating and as engaging as we can. And it's still very child-led, but we need to give pupils every opportunity they can to make that progress and to work towards them.
So because it's a low demand approach and there's lots of freedom given to the pupils, lots of independence, and they get the opportunity to engage with the resources in the way they best persist and initiate with that resource, how are decisions made about how the resources are put out? So for example, we've got a couple of children there throwing resources and kind of doing a lot of casting type behaviours. How do you decide how much of that you're going to allow, or what resources you put out to facilitate that?
I think it's really important to have things out that are going to be safe. So we have lots of pupils who mouth lots of things, taste different things. So whenever we've got continuous provision out, we make sure it's taste safe. Or if we know that pupils throw lots of things, ensuring that although that's not how I might typically choose to engage with something, it's up to the pupils how they choose to play with different things. So if they decide to throw something that I wouldn't necessarily throw, we need to make sure that the resources are safe so that they can be thrown, and just that actually it's child-led and that the pupils can engage in different things in the way that they want. And if they're still getting a lot of feedback, whether it be kind of physical feedback or cause and effect feedback through throwing things, then that's absolutely fine, and just making sure that they have the resources where they can do that appropriately and safely.
So I think one of the points that's worth going back to that we did mention earlier in the video is that these are some of, if not the most complex children that attend the school in terms of their communication and interaction and their ability to engage with activities, resources and learning. How does this differ, the presentation here of what we're seeing, the level, because there's quite a high level of engagement. You've talked a little bit about how we make that meaningful by scaffolding their next steps of learning from their PLPs, and that we do use that persistence that we're seeing and make that very meaningful, and actually we introduce challenge to that. But how does this differ? How does this presentation differ from maybe what we were seeing in September? This is about, I believe, March time.
Yeah.
How does this differ from what we were seeing in September?
So hugely, so kind of each individual pupil, so Nadia, the girl who's sitting in the corner, is possibly one of the most complex children in school in terms of being quite dysregulated, displaying a lot of challenging behaviour. And this is where the low demand approach has really, really worked, that actually we always encourage adults to go, why? Why do they have to do that thing? And if you can't really have a good reason, whether it be, well, they have to do it because they need to stay safe, or it's really important for adults to always think why, and that pupils need to learn to self-regulate, and if they're not regulated, they can't cope with adults putting demand after demand after demand on them. And with that, again, back to the pupil's voice being respected. So if pupils say, no, I'm not doing something, for adults to respect that and go, that's fine, that's your decision. So there's no need to communicate through behaviour, because what the pupil wants is being met. How regulated and calm these pupils are, who are really, really complex, just has shown that following a low demand approach has really, really worked for them. So there's a glimpse of how we've adapted the Equals Informal Curriculum within our school and within my classroom.
If you're interested in finding out more about the informal approach, you can get in touch with Equals at the address in the description below.